September 12, 2008. 4:22 in the afternoon. A Metrolink commuter train carrying 222 passengers rolls through the Chatsworth neighborhood of Los Angeles and approaches a red signal at 44 miles per hour. The signal is real. The restriction has been transmitted correctly through every system designed to transmit it. The infrastructure is functioning exactly as built. The engineer's cell phone, recovered later from the wreckage, contains an outgoing log of 57 text messages from that single shift, the last one sent 22 seconds before impact. The Metrolink train enters a single-track section where a Union Pacific freight train is already running the other direction. The collision kills 25 people. The force of the impact drives the locomotive 52 feet into the lead passenger coach. 6 weeks later, Congress passes a law. That law, over the next 12 years, will cost the American railroad industry $15 billion. And on February 3, 2023, with the system fully installed and operational across tens of thousands of miles of American track, a train will derail in eastern Ohio, and not $1 of that $15 billion will be relevant to what happens. The Rail Safety Improvement Act of 2008 is built around a single engineering premise, that on a moving train, the human in the cab is the system's most unreliable component. The engineer who died in Chatsworth, Robert M. Sanchez, was 46 years old. He was not careless by professional record. He was a licensed locomotive engineer who, on the afternoon of September 12th, sent text message after text message to a railroad enthusiast club while his train was bearing down on a stop signal at highway speed. The signal was doing its job. Sanchez was not doing his. Positive train control exists to override exactly that failure, to put a second set of hands on the controls that cannot be distracted, cannot miss a signal, and cannot be persuaded by momentum or habit to keep going when the track ahead says, "Stop." PTC is a GPS-based overlay system that does not replace the existing signal architecture. It rides on top of it. A locomotive equipped with PTC receives continuous position data, speed restrictions, and movement authorities from a back-office server transmitted via 220 MHz radio. If the locomotive exceeds its authority, enters a restricted section, overspeeds a curve, or runs a signal, the system applies the brakes before the engineer can react. The mandate required its installation on all Class I main lines carrying passengers or toxic by inhalation hazardous materials, covering approximately 57,536 route miles, roughly 40% of the national freight rail network. Congress set the original deadline at December 31, 2015. That deadline was missed by every railroad subject to the mandate because the technology required to meet it did not exist when the law was signed. Railroads spent the years after 2008 developing, testing, and manufacturing a system from scratch, building, as one industry observer described it, an entirely new AIR traffic control system for a network the size of a continent, while simultaneously operating that network around the clock, every day, without interruption. In May 2013, the Federal Communications Commission halted construction of 35,000 wayside interface units and 25,000 signal poles for more than a year to conduct historic preservation and tribal impact reviews on the tower infrastructure PTC required. A separate federal agency created a delay in a federally mandated safety deadline. Congress extended the deadline to December 31, 2018. Most railroads missed that one too. The final authorized extension ran to December 31, 2020. Full implementation was declared complete on December 29, 2020, 12 years after the mandate, 2 years past the last deadline Congress explicitly authorized. BNSF Railway spent approximately $2 billion across its 11,500 mandated route miles. Union Pacific spent $2.9 billion. CSX spent $2.4 billion. The FRA contributed $3.4 billion in grants and loans across all 41 mandated railroads. Total industry capital expenditure was $15 billion, roughly equal to the combined annual capital investment of every U.S. freight railroad, redirected for a decade into a single safety system. The National Transportation Safety Board had been recommending something like this since August 1969, when two Penn Central commuter trains collided head-on in Darien, Connecticut, killing 3 crew members and 1 passenger. The recommendation that year asked Congress to study the feasibility of automatic train control on dark territory, meaning sections of track with no signal infrastructure, where a train crew operated entirely on schedule and order, with no electronic check on whether authority had been correctly read or followed. The Federal Railroad Administration reviewed it, determined the cost was prohibitive, and closed the recommendation as acceptable action. In 1990, PTC appeared on the NTSB's inaugural Most Wanted list of transportation safety improvements, the agency's formal designation for the safety failures it considered most urgent and most preventable. Recommendations followed in 1996 and again in 2000. Each time, the railroad industry's argument that voluntary programs were sufficient, combined with the genuine cost and technical complexity of any nationwide implementation, carried the argument for deferral in Washington. In the 51 years between that first Darien recommendation and the declaration of full PTC implementation, 154 accidents that PTC could have prevented occurred across the American rail network. Those 154 accidents killed 305 people and left 6,883 others injured. 39 years of documented recommendations, 39 years of accepted deferral, then Chatsworth, then 6 weeks, then a law. The Class I railroads absorbed their share of the $15 billion. The bill was large and the deadlines were missed twice, but for a carrier with $2.9 billion to spend, the mandate was a capital project, painful, complex, and survivable. The Buckingham Branch Railroad of Central Virginia had no equivalent relationship with that math. The Buckingham Branch operates 200 miles of track through the Virginia Piedmont, including a 125-mile segment between Orange and Clifton Forge that Amtrak uses for 6 trains per week. 1 train every other day runs on a stretch of rural track the railroad has operated for decades without a reportable collision. When the Federal Railroad Administration finalized its positive train control interoperability requirements, the Buckingham Branch received its compliance estimate, $12 to $17 million. Steve Powell, the railroad's senior vice president, did the arithmetic and then stated it publicly so that no one in Washington could claim the number was imprecise. If the Buckingham Branch applied every dollar of its Amtrak revenue, the revenue that justified positive train control compliance in the first place, to installation costs, at 0 interest, the repayment period was 150 years. Powell said there was no way they could implement it. The cost would bankrupt them. The average American short-line railroad earns $7.7 million in annual revenue. It runs 79 miles of track. It employs fewer than 30 people. Together, approximately 600 short-line railroads in the United States operate nearly 50,000 route miles, about 40% of the national freight network, and handle 1 in every 4 rail cars moved at origin or destination. They are the first and last mile of the American supply chain, the link between a grain elevator in a small Kansas town and a Class I main line, between a rural manufacturer and a national distribution hub. Removing a short line from that chain does not reduce the region's freight options. In most cases, it eliminates them. The Rail Safety Improvement Act of 2008 explicitly exempted short lines. Class II and Class III railroads, the legal designations covering every carrier earning less than the Class I revenue threshold, were not named in the mandate. The exemption was written into the statute. What the statute did not address, and what the FRA did not clarify until years after passage, when the Class I railroads submitted their implementation plans, was the interoperability requirement embedded in how PTC actually functions in the field. PTC is not a system. A railroad installs on its own property and operates independently. It is a communication architecture that requires every locomotive operating on a PTC-equipped line to carry compatible hardware, because the back-office server managing movement authorities cannot issue a safe clearance to a locomotive it cannot track. When Union Pacific installs PTC on 32,000 miles of its main line, every short line locomotive that crosses Union Pacific territory must carry PTC-compatible onboard equipment. The law exempted small railroads from building the wayside infrastructure. It did not exempt their locomotives from accessing it. Fewer than 100 Class II and Class III carriers fell into this interoperability zone, technically exempted by the letter of the law, practically swept in through the operational reality of how the system enforces safety on shared track. Installing positive train control hardware on a locomotive built in the early 1970s is not a firmware update. The average short-line locomotive is 25 years old. Many units in active short-line service were designed and manufactured before digital electronics were standard locomotive components. Retrofitting them requires specialized onboard computing systems, 220 MHz radio hardware, GPS integration, and the engineering labor to make it function on a platform that was never designed to accommodate any of it. Cost per locomotive runs from $70,000 to $150,000, depending on the unit's age and configuration. The North Carolina Railroad manages a 317-mile corridor used daily by more than 60 Norfolk Southern trains and 8 Amtrak services. Its president, Scott Saylor, put his total compliance estimate at $20 million SWAS. Approximately 2 years of the railroad's total annual revenue. Saylor said that would be 2 years of our revenues. He said we would not be able to do other projects. The Federal Railroad Administration awarded the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association $2.5 million to help negotiate vendor agreements and reduce costs for affected small carriers. That grant, the federal government's contribution to solving the impossible math for the smallest operators, covered approximately 15 weeks of installation costs for one average affected railroad. Several short lines, including the Buckingham branch and the Vermont rail system, eventually obtained formal exemptions from the Federal Railroad Administration. The process required documentation, legal counsel, and a demonstrated record of compliance impossibility. Some small railroads had the capacity to assemble that record, and some did not. The ones that could fight, fought. The deeper story, the one that does not appear in FRA press releases or congressional hearing transcripts, runs backward to 1980. The Staggers Rail Act deregulated freight railroading by removing the pricing controls that had driven major carriers toward insolvency through the 1970s. One direct consequence of Staggers was a massive transfer of marginal branch lines from Class I railroads to independent operators. Short lines could run those lines profitably at lower overhead, and the Class I carriers were freed from losses they could no longer sustain. Between 1980 and 2015, the number of short-line railroads in the United States grew from approximately 100 to more than 600. The sector that exists today is a product of that deregulation. 28 years after Staggers, the Rail Safety Improvement Act of 2008 applied a compliance cost to those same short lines that functioned economically like a return to the conditions Staggers was designed to fix, not through rate controls, but through a capital requirement sized for carriers 10 times larger. The policy was framed entirely as safety. The economic mechanism was the same. The railroads that survived the mandate and the exemption process are still operating. In 2025, 371 of 418 ASLR-RA member railroads earned zero-injury certification, a record. And then, on February 3, 2023, a Norfolk Southern freight train moved through eastern Ohio. Positive Train Control, PTC, was active and fully operational. 38 of its cars left the rails. The train was traveling at 47 miles per hour, 3 miles per hour below the posted maximum. Its movement was fully authorized. PTC had no reason to intervene because the train was doing nothing. PTC is designed to prevent. On car 23, a wheel bearing was failing. A wayside detector in Salem, Ohio, recorded an elevated temperature as the train passed. The alert was classified low priority. No action was required. The train continued west. A second detector, 11 miles later, registered 103 degrees above the ambient temperature. It remained below the threshold for crew notification. The third detector, 19 miles farther, registered 253 degrees above ambient. That reading crossed the protocol threshold. The crew received an alarm and immediately applied the brakes. By the time the train decelerated enough for the crew to safely exit, the bearing had already failed. 38 cars were off the rails. 11 carried hazardous materials. 5 tank cars containing 115,000 gallons of vinyl chloride were eventually vented and burned. The NTSB confirmed in its preliminary report in February 2023 and again in its final report in June 2024 that PTC was active and that it played no role in either causing or preventing the derailment. PTC cannot read a bearing temperature. It cannot integrate wayside detector output into its movement authority decisions. It cannot prevent a mechanical failure building silently across thousands of miles of freight movement. This is a limited system with a massive cost. The $15 billion system is exactly as capable as it was designed to be. It was designed for one category of accident. The FRA's own 2009 estimate projected annual safety benefits from full PTC implementation at $90 million per year, the calculated value of the accidents. PTC would prevent each year, measured in lives, injuries, property, and freight delay. At $90 million per year in projected benefit, the recovery period is 166 years. The Buckingham Branch Railroad's 150-year repayment calculation was not an outlier. It was, within a margin of a single decade, the federal government's own arithmetic applied to a different question. The NTSB asked for automatic train control in 1969, and in 1990, and in 1996, and in 2000. Congress deferred each time. In those 39 years of documented deferral, 305 people died in accidents that PTC would have prevented. Robert M. Sanchez sent his 57th text message in September 2008, and 6 weeks later, the law that 4 decades of NTSB recommendations had not produced was signed and on the books. The implementation took 12 years. It cost $15 billion. It missed its own deadline twice. The system it built will stop a train when the engineer is not paying attention. It will not stop a bearing from failing at 2 in the morning in rural Ohio. The 600 short-line railroads that handle 1 in 4 American rail cars, that serve 10,000 customers in towns where they represent the only freight rail option available, and that earned a record number of zero-injury certifications in 2025, were handed a compliance architecture designed around a failure mode they had not produced. The Staggers Act gave them back the tracks in 1980. The Rail Safety Improvement Act of 2008 is still collecting the interest.